Hi, I'm Dr. David Dobson. Welcome to Conversations. Today, my guest is Dr. Chigbo Arthur Anyaduba. Chibu is an associate professor in the English department at the University of Winnipeg. He has a PhD in English from the University of Manitoba. His literary work focuses on the cultural representations of genocide and mass atrocities in Africa. Today, we will be discussing his book, The Postcolonial African Genocide Novel, Quest for Meaningfulness. It's a pleasure to have you on my show, Chibu.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Chibu, why did you write this book?
I mean that's a challenging question each time I hear questions like that. And the reason is because it's not usually straightforward to understand why one has done something, especially something like writing a book. But the post-colonial African genocide novel derived from my doctoral dissertation research in fictional representations of genocides that occurred in what one might describe as post-colonial Nigeria and Rwanda. And I was trying to understand the kinds of imaginative stories, in other words, fictional stories that genocides provoke or inspire for writers. So I would say that I wrote the book to call attention to a tradition of imaginative literature in Africa that is committed to bearing witness to genocides and mass atrocities, especially in the so-called post-colonial moment.
Thank you, Chibu, for sharing your the background of your book. And I know it's not a easy subject, as you mentioned. Can I ask you why was it important for you to address this genocide in the post-colonial African context?
Mm, that's a good question. But to be sure, when I say post-colonial genocide in Africa,
Mm,
I did not mean to suggest that these
mm,
genocides are occurring in, if you like, the aftermath of
mm,
colonization.
mm.
As many post-colonial critics know too well,
Yeah.
post-colonial is not necessarily about an after,
Mm,
but instead it's a way of reading and understanding
mm,
ongoing forms of colonial violence and
mm,
ideologies. So while the genocides covered in the book focus on atrocities that occurred in the post-independence era, which is supposed to be an era where the African nation or state is believed to be self-ruling. The literatures I study in the book contradict any understanding of these moments as an aftermath of colonization. What came out more strongly in the literatures is an insistence on showing us that the genocides in question have been instigated and, in fact, executed largely in the interest of Western imperial nations. So, to your question, I
mhm.
think it was important for me to address
Yeah.
these genocides
Mm,
and mass atrocities to
mm,
call attention to how they are part of,
mm,
and if you like,
mm,
continuations of the
mm,
Western colonial
mm,
projects in Africa.
mm,
And this is, I think, a very important point
mm, mm,
because mainstream
mm,
Western and other media, as well
mm,
as in
mm,
academic discourses,
mm,
would rather have us think that genocides
mm,
in Africa are purely
mm,
African affairs,
mm,
in which Western states are bystanders
mm, mm,
seeking ways to provide humanitarian interventions and whatnot.
mm,
As the literatures I discuss
mm,
in the book show, the reality is that Western states are more often than not the architects of genocides occurring in the supposedly official aftermaths of colonization in Africa.
mm, mm. Can I ask you, I know focus of your writing is this genocide and mass atrocities. Do you have your personal story to this on this topic?
Like personal stories that my family survived the genocide of Igbo people in Nigeria in
Mm,
the 60s,
mm,
and continue to live
mm,
through the repercussions of that past,
yeah,
especially given
yeah.
continuations of anti-Igbo
Mm,
racism in
mm,
Nigeria.
mm,
So I have, we lost several relatives, several
mm,
uncles.
mm,
My grandma lost property through the policy of what they called abandoned property policy in Nigeria that
mm.
uh, gave Igbo property to other people in regions
Mhm,
where they wanted
mhm.
to get rid of the
Right.
Igbo and
Yeah.
so on.
Yeah.
So there's a direct connection to my own family experience.
Mm, mm,
At the same time, growing up, that history was everywhere around me, and
mm, mm,
in ways I didn't understand until much
mm,
later when I started studying this subject.
mm. And that's perhaps reason why you wanted to explore this topic more and focus more, so that you explain to the people who don't know this side of the story.
Create a strong understanding
Okay.
of what happened at the same time, let people understand, if you like, to use
Yeah.
Achebe's famous proverb,
Mm,
that if you don't know where the rain began to beat you, you
mm.
wouldn't know where it stopped, and that historical knowledge continues to shape how
Okay.
life is lived now.
Okay. Your writing focuses on the traumatic stories that emerged before, during, and especially after genocide and mass atrocities. Uh, what does these stories mean to you,
Ah.
Chibo?
Oh, okay. So maybe the way I should answer this question is just to describe the four novels that
Okay.
I studied for this book.
Mm,
And these novels are more of a representative
mm,
of larger bodies
mm,
of works.
mm,
So the four main novels I discussed in the
mm,
book are indeed,
mm,
in agreement with your framing of it, they are indeed traumatic stories.
mm,
One is called Season of Anomy,
mm,
written by Wole Soyinka, who is one of the
mm,
most celebrated African writers of the
mm,
20th century. The story is based on the genocide of Igbo people in Nigeria between 1966 and 1970. Soyinka's story was also based partly on his prison experience at the time because he was
mm,
jailed for
mm,
publicly condemning the Nigerian government for
mm,
committing genocide and so on. But Soyinka's writings, for those who are familiar with his works, they are not usually the most accessible you can find. And this novel is not an exception.
mm,
The story is told as an African version of the Greek mythology of Orpheus.
mm,
The Orpheus myth is based on the legend of a man who journeys to the underworld, which
mm,
is the resting place of the dead, in order to recover his dead wife. And
mm,
through his musical prowess, Orpheus succeeds in convincing the guardians of the underworld to release his wife to him.
mm,
And they agree, but instruct him not to look back to see who is behind him until he exits the underworld.
mm,
However, his curiosity got the better of him and he fails this test. In Shoyinka's novel, the Nigerian Orpheus visits the underworld of a genocidal nation to rescue his comatose wife.
mm,
And his presence in this underworld, this
mm,
place, serves
mm,
as kind of witnessing
mm,
of the horrendous atrocities
mm,
that were perpetrated against
mm,
victims. However, unlike the
mm,
Greek myth,
mm,
Shoyinka's stories showing Orpheus succeeds in rescuing his wife from hell.
mm,
And one way to understand Shoyinka's story, I think, is to see it as an artistic refusal to succumb to, if you like, cynicism. Because more often than not, the reality of genocides attacks our imagination
mm,
and our ability to think and act ethically and with conviction. So
mm,
Srinka's story seems to, I think, dramatize a heroic attempt to
mm,
confront the cynicism that genocide can elicit in order for us to be able to bear witness against atrocities.
mm,
Another novel I discussed in
mm,
the book
mm,
based on the genocide of Igbo people in Nigeria is called Half of a Yellow Sun.
mm,
written by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who is
mm,
one of the most celebrated African writers
mm,
of the 21st century.
mm,
The novel tells the story of an Igbo family
mm,
survival against the enormous odds of a
mm,
genocide unleashed
mm,
against Igbo people.
mm,
And unlike Soyinka's mythical realism, Adichie's novel is presented as social realism
mm,
and is significant for its attention on the experiences of historically marginalized groups,
mm,
most especially women and
mm,
lower class people.
mm,
Um, the two novels I discuss in the book based on the genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda are
mm,
Murambi, the Book of Bones by the Senegalese writer Boubacar Boris Diop, and A Sunday at the Pool in Kigali by the late Canadian writer Gil Coutmonge.
mm,
Murambi, the Book of Bones is one of the most powerful stories I ever read about any genocide at all.
mm,
The main story in the novel follows a Rwandan exile who returns to the country after the genocide, believing that his whole family has been killed, only
mm,
to discover that his father is still alive and that in fact his father is implicated in the deaths of his mother and his siblings and thousands of other people from his hometown.
mm,
It's a powerful story, again, about the
mm,
complexities of genocide,
mm,
but I think more
mm,
importantly
mm,
about finding courage and will to
mm,
bear witness to
mm,
genocidal atrocities.
mm,
The last novel I discussed in the book, A Sunday at the Pool in Kigali, is The Outlier Walk, because for one, it's written by a non-African writer compared
mm,
to the other three books. And the story, which has a film adaptation called A Sunday in Kigali, I think, is based on a Canadian journalist's
mm,
love affair with a Tutsi woman
mm,
whom he fails to rescue before and during the genocide. However, I must add that my inclusion of Kutzman's novel in this book is not because it's a moving traumatic story about the
mm,
genocide in
mm,
Rwanda,
mm,
but more because
mm,
it's representative of the
mm,
kinds of, if you like, pornographic and racist representation of African traumatic experiences by Western writers and artists. So I used the novel to critique this racist tradition of writing about
mm,
African suffering.
mm,
But taking
mm,
together to
mm.
answer your question about what
Yeah,
these stories mean to me, I think
yeah,
these stories helped me to sort of understand the cultural purpose of traumatic stories.
right. Yeah. I'm just wondering, as you were going through these books, reading these books and preparing your own novel, what was your experience like uh, when you going through these stories? Like, I'm sure it's took quite a while to really come up different chapters of your books and different stories. And what was those experience like?
Um, I mean, because I read many of them during my PhD, so I was
Mm,
wearing my scholarly
okay,
hat. So
okay,
it was a bit, it wasn't easy because
yeah,
these are again difficult stories.
yeah,
They are traumatic stories.
yeah.
Also coming from
Mm, yeah,
my understanding of
yeah, yeah,
if kind of connection to some of
yeah.
these traumatic experiences
Mm,
made reading a little bit more
yeah,
challenging and unique.
yeah.
But yeah, you're right. I had to approach a lot of the works as
Mm,
research
mm,
to understand, in fact, my what made sense for writers.
mm,
Why do
mm,
people choose to write about these kinds
mm,
of stories in
mm,
the ways that they do?
yeah.
So but I was convinced I was doing the right thing, bringing these works
Yeah,
to some kind of visual
yeah.
attention.
Mm,
Uh, but more interestingly, the difficulty was to pick because I
mm,
read over 100 works based on these two experiences. So the
mm,
bigger difficulty was to pick which one uh,
yeah,
helped me to
yeah,
say something
yeah.
about so many other works.
Mm,
I arrived at these four. So each of those works sort of I discuss them as representative
mm,
of larger trends in
yeah,
some of the
yeah,
publications in the
yeah,
1960s.
yeah. I was wondering, I think you already mentioned a little bit about the stories. What purposes do these traumatic stories serve?
Mm, mm. Uh, yeah, that's a very good question. Again, the stories I think are significant for several reasons that we
Mm,
cannot easily cover in a short interview session. But to begin with, I think they are important
mm,
in
mm,
highlighting the ways that
yeah,
stories
yeah,
can be used to kill people.
mm, mm,
So a lot of, for example, a lot of
mm,
stories Europeans told about African and
mm,
other colonized peoples were,
mm,
and some have continued to be profoundly
mm,
dangerous, deadly
mm,
stories.
mm,
These stories denied the humanity of African people
mm,
and worked to regularize and normalize the violence Europeans perpetrated against
mm,
Africans, as well as normalize the ongoing theft of African resources.
mm,
So many of these dangerous stories, I think, continue to influence how not just non-Africans, but primarily how
mm,
Africans, how some African peoples see themselves and other Africans.
mm,
So the traumatic stories I discussed in the book seem very mindful of this potential of storytelling to kill people. Uh,
mm,
at the same time, they are aware of
mm,
the potential of storytelling to educate,
mm,
to redeem,
mm,
to expose atrocities, and
mm,
to foster empathy.
mm,
And many of the stories are marked by this awareness of the complex work of literature.
mm,
But that said, it's important to understand that the purpose of a traumatic story it cannot be definitively fixed. A traumatic story is susceptible to temporal realities, and its
mm,
purpose in our
mm,
time may change or vary
mm,
in another
mm,
time.
mm,
For example, in the Nigerian context of today, these stories are received differently because
mm,
the national disposition is still deeply invested in anti-Igbo racism.
mm,
And in such a climate, the stories, I think, seem to be mobilized to humanize and foster empathy
mm,
for historical and present-day Igbo victims of genocide atrocities. In Rwanda is yeah, perhaps a bit different. Many of the stories are used to commemorate and
mm,
and focus much more on the memory of the
mm,
dead.
mm, mm. It's great. As you already mentioned, that your book focuses on the genocide and mass atrocities in Nigeria and Rwanda. Uh, can you share why you chose these two countries?
Mm. And again, terrific question. Um, yeah, I mean the two genocides. Okay,
Mm,
so the two genocides in question, first, they've produced some of the
yeah.
most sustained literary responses in
Mm,
Africa.
mm,
Uh, and I think the most, if not, if you're not adding the experience of South African apartheid, uh,
mm,
um, yeah, but at the same time, both atrocities are crudely familiar
mm,
and produce strangely similar patterns of
mm,
storytelling or imaginative stories, even though they occurred several years apart and they occurred at different historical interfaces in Africa's
mm,
post-colonial history. So the Nigerian atrocities took place between 1966 and 1970,
mm,
and the primary victims were Igbo people who were targeted with extermination and
mm,
deportation
mm,
across different parts of the country.
mm,
That was following a military coup that happened
mm,
in January 1966. By the time the conflict had subsided in 1970, it was believed that more than 3 million people died. 3 million human beings. We are not talking about all the other kinds of destructions, just human beings. And many more millions were wounded and traumatized. Many of them continue to remain traumatized till today. Many of the casualties were victims of brutal physical attacks with
mm,
machetes, with clubs, with stones, with guns and bombs. Rapes were also used as weapons of genocide. The violence was gruesome. In some cases, pregnant women were disemboweled and their fetuses played. Children were killed before their parents. Husbands were beheaded as their wives and children were forced to watch. Um, in some other cases, the bodies of dead victims were mutilated by the killers, especially the killings that took place outside Igbo land throughout 1966 and 1970. In those cases, killers sometimes loaded the mutilated corpses of their Igbo victims into lorries and trains and had them transported back to the eastern region, the Igbo homeland, so that the gory sight of the bodies would perhaps send traumatic waves and inflict more psychological pains on victims' relatives. Several other victims' bodies were dumped in the Niger River, which coursed from the northern region through the southeastern region into the Atlantic Ocean. So the understanding is that they were sending those bodies back to the
mm,
east. So these horrible practices were carried out with the mindset, I think, of doing violence, not to a specific individual victim, but
mm,
to the Igbo generically conceived, so which is why, again, there are some people understood what happened as clearly genocide.
mm,
In other words, violence was carried out to inflict maximum
mm,
pain and cruelty
mm,
on a group on a
mm,
group of
yeah.
people. And most Igbo victims of the atrocities, however, died through mass starvation that the Nigerian federal military government at the time used to destroy Igbo populations during the Biafran War. The mass starvation was carried out by blockading the Igbo homeland and preventing aid into the region, leading to hundreds of thousands of deaths every day. Uh, so the Igbo experience of genocide in Nigeria, I think, was significant for several reasons, including how it reshaped humanitarian advocacies in the world, and as well how survivors, including Holocaust survivors, of other atrocities came to make sense of their own experiences. And equally, it was one of the first major moments in post-independence Africa when the concept of genocide was mobilized and deliberated to make sense of mass violence. So yeah, that's but the Rwandan genocide is arguably the most popular or
Yeah.
widely genocide so
Yeah.
in Africa today. And so necessarily it invites attention for any study on the literatures about genocides in Africa. The Rwandan atrocities took place mostly between 1990 and 1994, even though the 1994 atrocities have exclusively been the focus of several stories. But just as in the Nigerian case, nobody knows for sure how many people died in the Rwandan genocide, but the casualty figures were over 1 million, and millions others wounded and traumatized. Several massacres were carried out by regular common people in their neighborhoods and in different sites of death. The genocide was equally severely physically brutal. The killers murdered their victims in close proximity using machetes, stones, clubs, as well as guns and grenades, and rapes were rampant. In some cases, perpetrators knowingly inflicted their victims with HIV, which was already an epidemic in Rwanda at the time, even before the genocide. Some of the killings took place in enclosed public spaces, like churches, like schools, and roadblocks built mainly to prevent victims from escaping.
Mm,
So the effect of the patterns of killings
mm,
was to turn massacres into theater, into a
mm,
ritual.
mm,
Other mass killings happened in forests and marshes, as perverse forms of hunting.
mm,
In many instances, the killer and the victim knew each other very well. Um, so the
Mm,
Rwandan genocide also again triggered broader conflicts in the region and has
mm,
continued to give impetus to the atrocities still
mm,
ongoing today in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
mm,
In fact, the conflict in Congo post 1994 genocide has
mm,
claimed many more million lives than
mm,
the genocide in Rwanda.
mm,
But I think I deliberately emphasize the
mm,
gruesomeness of
mm,
these atrocities in the
mm,
uh, not to not merely to
mm,
highlight their
mm,
similarities, but mainly
mm,
so we can understand the challenge that
mm,
some writers and artists have had to grapple with in the attempt to write literature about such
mm.
atrocious experiences.
Yeah.
So how do you even begin to make sense of these killings? We know the stories told about atrocities, but for me, I was interested in what is the stake for writers following these patterns of exterminatory violence, and what is the work of literature responding to these violent encounters. So those are some of the things I considered in the book.
Chibo, what do you hope the reader takes away from your book?
That's a tricky question. Especially if we work of literary criticism. I don't know what I expect readers of my book to take away from it, but my hope is that the book might instigate further interest in these genocides and encourage people to carry out their own extensive research and
Mm,
educate themselves about the
mm,
world we live in.
mm,
It's a world that has continued to tolerate and
mm,
actively instigate genocides. So,
mm,
particularly for people living in this part of the world, my hope is for them to recognize that much of the privileges and comforts they enjoy here come at the expense of millions of lives routinely destroyed elsewhere, most especially in Africa, right? We use computers and phones and all these technologies these
mm,
days. They had to destroy a lot of lives to get the materials that they are using to do these things.
mm,
Destroy the lives of kids, turn
mm,
them into slaves, and so on. So it's that recognition, I think, that
mm,
I'm hoping people would
mm,
take these things seriously.
mm, mm. I know you are also a professor. So, how does your research in this topic change your teaching style, and how do you incorporate some of this material into your own teaching?
That's one of the biggest challenges of my life because I mean one of the questions I grapple with is what exactly is teachable about genocide?
Mm,
What do we stand to learn like
mm, mm,
about the ways people kill other people?
mm,
How can you teach that?
mm,
Traumatic subjects are not the easiest to teach. I work in a discipline where we encourage people to read
mm,
deeply and closely and so on. But why do you have to read trauma deeply? You can actually be traumatized. The woman and some other people the woman who worked with Romeo Dallaire, the Canadian general who was in charge of the
mm,
peacekeeping mission in Rwanda during the genocide, the woman who helped him to gather materials for his memoir called Shake Hands with the Devil,
mm,
she couldn't take in the atrocities. She committed suicide during that project. And there are so many other examples of people who get overwhelmed reading these kinds of stories and trying to make sense of these horrendous experiences. So what exactly am I trying to teach people? I mean, these are
mm,
challenging questions.
mm,
But part of what I learned
mm,
doing this kind of work that I think had informed how I go about teaching some of my subjects. I think it's first humility, the fact that you can't really teach anything. People have to like learn what they choose to learn,
mm,
and that knowledge is much more than what we know.
mm,
It comes with some other kinds of things, a different kind of
mm,
critical awareness.
mm,
Um, but allowance of complexity, different ways in which storytelling could um,
mm,
work, make us know things. The
mm,
fact that, in fact, without storytelling, it's difficult for us to make meaning as human beings.
mm,
So I think I appreciated much more the power of storytelling.
mm,
At the same time, the significance of critical engagement with stories. Many times we are uncritical. We are not that critical in how we consume stories. So we just consume stories thinking, yeah, they are stories, but that virtually any kind of story out there is loaded with deeper political underpinnings that if you are not aware of them,
mm,
they can, in fact, make you think or see the world in ways that you're not even paying attention to. So,
mm, mm,
so yeah, but these again questions are complex, and I think continue to inform how I go about teaching and making sense of the world with students through
mm,
storytelling.
mm. Uh, so what is next for you, Chigbo?
Hmm. I am currently invested in two different but not entirely unrelated research projects.
Yeah.
The first is a study in cultural representations of the mass starvation of Igbo people by the Nigerian government during the Biafran War.
Mm,
That's because much of the notoriety of that war was based on the experience of mass starvation when
mm,
images of starving women and children circulated widely in the late 60s and so on. And I find it strange that not a lot of research has gone into how writers and artists
mm,
uh, grappled and are still grappling with the experience of that mass starvation in their works. So my focus is on that. And that focus is also uh, because I aim to use that mass starvation to call attention to the economics of genocide and mass atrocities
mm,
that we often don't give due attention. The My second research project is a study of contemporary African writings in Canada, focusing on the experiences of African immigrants in this country. The last few years have seen several writings by African immigrant writers published, and I think it's important to study these works because I suspect they might tell us not only what we know too well about racism and the challenges that immigrants go through in Canada, but also something about how African immigrants are constructing, if you like, new origin stories of how they come to be here in this moment in time.
mm.
So yeah, that's those are the two projects I'm doing right now.
Nice. Thank you so much for your time, Chigbo. I appreciate discussing your book, Postcolonial African Genocide Novel, and your current work. I wish you all the best on the important work you're doing.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the time and your invitation to have me be part of your wonderful podcast.